This is the Meetinghouse with Dwight A. Moody. News, reviews, commentary, and conversation on religion and American life. Now, here is Dr. Moody.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Meetinghouse. Today, coming to you from Hendersonville, North Carolina, I am your host, Dwight Moody. Glad to participate in these conversations on religion and American life. Thank you for joining us, whether it's by radio. We broadcast over Rejoice Radio down in the Golden Isles of Georgia, or whether it's through the social media, Facebook and YouTube, or whether you're listening to it as a podcast. This show will be posted as a podcast within 24 hours, and you may be listening to it a year after we broadcast it here in November of 2021. We have an interesting program today. 2 weeks ago, I was on the courthouse steps in Brunswick, Georgia, following the trial there, as we have those events for now a year and 9 months. As many of you know, my home is in Glenn County. The county seat is Brunswick, and the show launched just a week after Ahmaud Arbery was murdered on the streets of Brunswick. We've been following this ever since, and 2 weeks ago I was on the steps broadcasting with 20 other national media people. And today the trial is going on. Yesterday the defense began their work, and the defendants are even today on the stand giving their side of the story. I'll have more to say about that a little later in the show. I've got a movie review of the new movie about C.S. Lewis, The Most Reluctant Convert. As many of you know, I've been a fan of C.S. Lewis for 50 years or more, and he's had a great influence on my life. I saw the movie. I have a review of it. And then my commentary, is this a spiritual discipline? Comes out of my conversation last week on this program with Dr. Lori Carroll, who's the chancellor of the University of Minnesota at Rochester. I asked her the question, what a spiritual discipline has been central to your career and to your success, and her answer surprised me a great deal. I wrote about it, and I'm going to share that a little bit later in the show. Today, my guest is David Shea, Deacon of the Archdiocese of Cincinnati and Professor of Homiletics at the Athenaeum at Mount St. Mary's in Cincinnati, which is the Catholic seminary there. Beautiful place where I've been many times. He's also the #1 fan of the Cincinnati Reds, and he's training his grandchildren in the same fervor, right?
Yeah.
Welcome back, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Dwight. It's always good to be with you. Glad that we met so many years ago and have had this opportunity to do things together. So thanks for having me.
It's really been great. And Dave has been on the show several times. And today we're going to talk about what's going on in the Catholic Church. And we're going to talk about his own archdiocese in Cincinnati. And but we'll do all that after the news. I'm going to start the news with a story in San Antonio, Texas. The Reawaken America tour made a 3-day stop in San Antonio, Texas, and what was said there has caused quite a stir all across the country. It was a standing room crowd gathered in the famous Cornerstone Church, a collection of right-wing Republicans, evangelical and Pentecostal Christians, QAnon speculators, and high-visibility Trumpsters. Pastor John Hagee, very well known with an international television ministry, General Mike Flynn, Executive Mike Lindell, conspirator Alex Jones, and anti-vaxxer Sherry Tenpenny all shared the stage. But it was the assertion that has caused all the commotion made by General Flynn when he said this, quote, "If we're going to have one nation under God, which we must, we have to have one religion, one nation under God, one religion under God, end quote. Later, the church disavowed the political messages of this rally, but nevertheless, they hosted it. And I think it's a strange thing. David, what do you think about this? This tour that they are on started actually up in Wisconsin, and I'll tell you this story. The first place they went, we did a story on it in the Meetinghouse, and because I quoted one of their speakers as challenging the vaccination protocol, Facebook flagged us as the perpetrators of false conspiracies and took that show off of Facebook simply because we were reporting what somebody else had said. I don't know whether you're familiar with this Reawaken America tour or not. Was that new to you?
Yes, it was. What's interesting, Dwight, in response to your questions, what do I think of this? Everything in this country has become politicized, right?
Yes.
And we can argue and debate the causes behind that, but it's found its way into religion, into every church, every denomination.
Yes.
And this statement by Flynn strikes me as being so much in contradiction to what we as a country have always embraced as one of the fundamental principles of who we are as a people, as a country, and that is a freedom of religion, or no religion for that matter, right? We respect the fact that in many cases people may choose somewhat temporarily, maybe more permanently, not to have a religion at all, and we respect that. And we so to make a statement like this is a radical departure from those founding principles.
But I'll tell you, Dave, it is the standard ideology of this movement that they are a part of. This whole white evangelical movement, which really contains many Catholics as well, has been fearful that they're losing their country, they're losing their religion, the country that they're losing their color, white. And so this movement to push back against all of this is trying to reassert Christianity, to reassert whiteness, to reassert local control of things. And I am not at all surprised that a person like Flynn said this in public. I think it has been said in private throughout this whole movement. And it not only this element of it, but many elements of this movement threaten, as you say, a great deal about the history and tradition and values of our own country.
Yeah, very troubling, very concerning.
It is very much so. Let's go to Brunswick, Georgia. I've already talked about it a little bit. Many people know that my home is down there in Brunswick. The main radio platform from which we broadcast is in Brunswick, Georgia, with outlets on St. Simon's Island. And we've been reporting on this trial for a long time, but it has taken a strange turn, and I do want to talk about it. The trial of Ahmaud Arbery took an odd turn when the defense attorney last week and again this week called attention to the presence in the courtroom, first of the Black Baptist preacher Al Sharpton of New York City, and this week, Pastor Jesse Jackson of Chicago.
Yeah.
Attorney Kevin Goh called their presence a distraction and an unwarranted influence on the jury. He said, quote, "How many pastors does the Arbery family need?" End quote. His request for Sharpton to be removed was denied this week. Jesse Jackson, now 80 years old, was in the courtroom, sitting quietly on the back pew, the back row. Defense attorneys requested his removal. It was denied. And the whole Arbery supporters, I've been a part of it. 2 weeks ago, I was down there, met with them. they've called for 100 Black ministers to gather and march in support of the Aubrey family and of what they see as justice. I assume you've been following all of this, Dave.
Yeah, I have. Absolutely. Yeah. Unfortunately, predicting the outcome here and the impact of the outcome, whatever it happens to be, is also something that will, keep us on the edge of our seats for the next, for however long this trial proceeds, and it finally turned over to a jury for verdicts.
Well, the thing is, David, it's going to go on longer than that, regardless of what the verdict is. There may be appeals, of course, but there's likely to be rallies and protests. But then there is a federal case, against all three of these people. And then there is a civil case. So all of these cases, plus, if there is a conviction in the state case right now, there has to be a sentencing, and there'll be a lot of politics around that. This is going to go on easily for another year and maybe even longer, especially if these men are actually sentenced and taken to a state prison somewhere. I still think, and I've said, and I've written this, that the likelihood of a largely 92% white jury convicting 3 white men of murdering a Black person, at best, it's a 50-50 shot in Georgia, regardless of what the evidence is. But I hope my cynicism is not unwarranted. Let's go to New York City.
Okay.
Publishers Weekly is highlighting 2 books about religion. The first one is called Public Confessions: The Religious Conversions That Changed American Politics, written by Rebecca Davis, published by the University of North Carolina Press. It describes the conversion of politician Clare Boothe Luce to Roman Catholicism, of communist Whittaker Chambers to Quakerism, of informant Harvey Mattisau to the Latter-day Saints, performer Sammy Davis Jr. to Judaism, and athlete Muhammad Ali to Islam. Before I go in and mention the second one, I think these 5 conversions to very, very different religious traditions illustrates the point you were making earlier, David, about how there's a freedom in our country to not only practice a religion or no religion, but to change your religion. The freedom to convert is as much a freedom as the freedom to participate. And one of these, Clare Boothe Luce, I think, was the senator from one of the New England states, Vermont maybe, and her conversion to Roman Catholicism. They could have also talked about Dwight David Eisenhower, who was baptized as a Presbyterian after he became president. Now you can hardly run for the president without being, in some sense, a practicing Christian, although Trump may be an exception to that. I don't know.
Yeah, my experience with conversion in the Catholic Church, frequently I encounter this issue when a couple is getting ready to get married in the Catholic Church. There's a Catholic party, either the bride or the groom, and the other future spouse have decided that they're going to get married in the Catholic Church. So the task of preparing them, to walking them through the process, over the years, my 23 years as a deacon, I've prepared hundreds of couples for that. And frequently what happens is the non-Catholic party to a marriage with a Catholic, in time, there's no requirement, first of all, that the non-Catholic convert to Catholicism or even make a commitment to do that in the future. All we hope for is that the Catholic continues to practice his or her faith in
Right.
a mixed marriage, we call it. But frequently in time, the non-Catholic party to a marriage with a Catholic seeks out conversion to Catholicism.
Mhm.
And so that process of conversion in the Catholic Church is referred to as the rite of Christian initiation of adults. Frequently, the acronym that people recognize it by is RCIA. But it's an intensive program of catechesis and also formation into the practices of the Catholic faith. It's more than just learning. It's more than just information. It's being formed into the practices of the Catholic faith. And that process can go on for as long as a year or longer, in some cases, a couple of years. And each parish has its own program and looks at these individuals case by case and then provides a formation experience for them that's kind of matched to where they are from a spiritual and religious standpoint. There may be someone from another faith who he or she is not particularly active in their religion, or their religion isn't a major force in their lives, but they're marrying a Catholic for whom the Catholic faith is important, and they decide in time that they want to share that with their spouse and with their family. My wife is an example of that. She was a second congregational Protestant at the time we got married, and she never missed church with me. She went to mass with me every single Sunday. I can't even think of a Sunday where she missed mass. And then when we had our daughter, our daughter made her first communion at the age of 7. I remember my wife telling me, she said, I watch you and Jennifer go up to receive communion, and I'm sitting here all by myself in the
Yeah.
pew. She said, I want you to know that I am raising a Catholic family. I am attending Catholic worship. I believe as you do, as you Catholics do, and I'm no longer going to stay in the pew by myself. So she entered a program of catechesis information with one of our parish priests. And I said, hey, what can I do to help? And she said, absolutely nothing. This is something that I want to do. And a few months later, she came home one evening and she said, Father Bob says I'm ready. And she was confirmed as a Catholic. So,
That's a great story. Earlier this year, I hosted in the Meetinghouse a Catholic convert whose father is a very close friend of mine and a Southern Baptist preacher. And she told her journey away from the Baptist church, actually into some wild and reckless living for a while. And then when she went into therapy, her therapist recommended that she start meditation. And she decided that she was going to find a meditation protocol that had its roots in religion. And for some reason, the idea of the rosary came to her. She's a lawyer, and she asked a friend who was a Catholic, also in the law firm, and gave her a rosary. It was the first time she'd ever seen a rosary, and she didn't know what to do with it. She had to hide it from her husband. And in her story to me on air, it was about how the rosary led her into the Catholic Church, and she now is the director of the initiation program at her Catholic Church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
wow.
Yeah, and just this morning I was going out, and I paused to speak to my neighbor. We got to talking to him. I asked him what he did. He asked me what I did, and turns out he also is a convert to Catholicism. And he said, I work with the children in confirmation. We have, I think he said, was it 50 or 60 people children that they are confirming. And he said, I do it so that I can learn more about by faith.
Whenever you have to teach someone
Yes.
anything, as you know,
Anything.
and
You're the one that learns.
Yeah, you really need to know what you know and what you don't know in order to stand in front of a classroom. I give a lot of talks for the Archdiocese, and what I've learned in that experience is that I can answer the vast majority of people's questions, but every once in a while, someone has a question about which I am not certain.
Yeah, of
So
course.
I'm not afraid to say, here is what I think the answer is.
Right.
I'm not 100% sure, but I promise I will get you a well-informed response
That's right.
after the fact. It's really important. I think those people who lead conversion programs are people of great faith, first of all, and they bring a wonderful commitment to bringing others to the Lord. So that's a great. You mentioned the rosary. It got me thinking. That's a very popular devotional practice in the Catholic Church. When the pandemic started, it was I think it was in the April timeframe. My youngest grandson, who I was not able to see in person during the early stages of the pandemic, we made a commitment to one another that we were going to pray the rosary every single night until there was a cure or an end. That's the way we put it back then, to the pandemic. So every single evening via technology, our phones, we sat there and we would pray the rosary together. And I think over the course of months, I'm talking months, we only missed like 1 or 2 times. He and I, at the time, he was 11 years old, would pray the rosary together every single evening. I have to tell you, Dwight, that on many, many days, that was the only thing that got me out of bed, and in what was an otherwise very depressing, isolating time.
Right.
As I looked forward to that, that 20 to 30 minutes with my grandson praying the rosary every evening. It was a wonderful experience. I even get emotional talking about it because it was such a special thing.
My grandson's 13 years old, and he calls me almost every day, normally in the mornings before he goes to school. And he doesn't want to pray the rosary. He goes to a Methodist church, but he wants to talk about basketball and football. So, I want to talk about this second book that Publishers Weekly is promoting. And it is fascinating to me. Journalist Daniel Silliman has written a book entitled Reading Evangelicals: How Christian Fiction Shaped a Culture and a Faith, published by Erdman's. He describes the influence of 5 novels on American evangelical culture. Here they are. I want to know, David, if you've read any of these. Love Comes Softly by Janet Oak. This Present Darkness by Frank Peretti. Left Behind by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. The Shunning by Beverly Lewis. And The Shack by William Paul Young.
I've read The Shack.
I've read The Shack.
Yeah, I've not read the others.
This Present Darkness by Frank Peretti. That was back in, I think, in the 80s. And I think you and I then are the only people in America who haven't read Left Behind, or one of those, however many volumes there were, 10 or 12 volumes. But I haven't seen the movies either. But I thought this was such a fascinating way to interpret what has happened in the United States. Love Comes Softly, of course, is a romance novel. This Present Darkness is a conspiracy novel. Left Behind is an end of the world series. The Shunning is set in an Amish or Mennonite. I think they made a movie out of that one. And then The Shack, of course, I remember reading it and thinking, oh, this is not very good, but millions of people loved it. And they made millions of dollars. I do know that the team of people who, it was a self-published book, The Shack, And it was only later, after it caught traction with the readership, that one of the major publishers picked it up. But after it started making money, the team of people who invested in it, who published it, broke apart. There were lawsuits involved and everything. Yeah, it's not a good story. But certainly the shack, everybody was talking about it for 6 to 8 years.
Well, I think what it provided for so many people was something tangible in what is otherwise very, very abstract, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
very much an issue of faith, right?
Yes.
So it became something we could get our arms around.
Sure.
We could, so fulfill that.
It was a story. Yeah. Okay, let's go to Baltimore now, right down your alley, David. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops is holding its annual meeting this week, today, in Baltimore, and yesterday. Headlining the agenda is a disagreement among the bishops about how to handle prominent politicians who are both Roman Catholic and defenders of the right to abortion. And I could name Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, and President Joe Biden. The conference began with an address by the papal nuncio, Christophe Pierre, who expressed the position of the Vatican that serving or withholding the Eucharist not be used to praise or punish politicians. The document that was approved overwhelmingly, I think there were maybe 8 votes against it.
Correct.
Outlines Catholic doctrine and practice on the Eucharist, does not mention any person by name or position, but does say this, and I want to quote: lay people who exercise some form of public authority have a special responsibility to embody church teaching, end quote. Now, what I want to ask is, non-religious or non-Catholic people, but non-Christian people, and even in relation to Islam, people who are outside of a dominant religion are fearful that religious people who hold power are going to implement their own religious values and religious practices and religious dogmas and prohibitions. This is one of the great fears about Islam in America.
Right.
It was a great fear about Catholicism. Back when John Kennedy was running.
Exactly. Yeah. I remember that.
Yes, and of course, it's being played out now in some ways where evangelicals are in power and they want to put their convictions into codified them into laws. So on the one hand, we don't want religious teaching to trump. We can't even hardly use that word anymore. But we don't want it to take precedent over constitutional rights and liberties. But when you read a statement like this, that the church wants people who are governors and judges and presidents to embody church teaching, what does this mean? What does it mean? How does it speak to these long-standing fears that people have about religious people of any tradition?
Yeah. This is a very complicated issue.
It is. Sure. It is a very complicated thing.
Yeah. This issue comes up obviously all the time, since it was a Nancy Pelosi issue, and now it's a Joe Biden Nancy Pelosi issue. But it's a bigger issue. The issue is, do we as ministers, both ordained and lay, because lay people are distributors of communion in Catholicism. They bring, they help out with the distribution of communion in the context of Catholic worship, but they also bring communion to the sick and the homebound, and they can be ministers of what we refer to as viaticum, which is the Eucharist provided to the dying individual.
Right.
as he or she leaves this life for eternal life. So the question always comes up is, what is the role of the minister as it pertains to giving or denying the Eucharist to the communicant, right? So that's the issue as far as, do you withhold or deny the politician, the Catholic politician, who is taking public positions that are contrary to Catholic teaching in such an area as the sacredness of human life, is the case with abortion here and Biden. But anyway, getting back to that issue of denying communion, our church says is that the minister, and whether you're talking about a priest or a deacon or a layperson who is the distributor of communion, you're standing there and an individual approaches you and extends his or her hands to receive the Eucharist. You know, what do you do if you, in your judgment, decide that this individual is not worthy to receive the Eucharist? Do you withhold the Eucharist from them, or do you deny them? And the answer to that is we don't. The minister doesn't. And our Archdiocese, our Archbishop Dennis Schnurr, a couple of years ago, before this series of workshops that I've been giving on behalf of the Archdiocese to extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, came out with a very clear statement on this. And it was phrased as a question: is it appropriate for an extraordinary minister, or any minister for that matter, to deny Holy Communion? And the answer the Archbishop provided on this was very succinct, very direct, and very clear. He just simply said, no, never, period. It is not the place of the minister to determine the worthiness of a communicant. So, yeah, I mean,
I want to take this a little further, because you're talking about giving it or denying it, withholding it from a Catholic.
correct.
And of course, as a Protestant myself, I've attended many Catholic worship services. And I know the rules, and I do not present myself, but I do go down for the blessing. So I think in this whole context about whether there is a Catholic that's worthy or not worthy of receiving communion, the question I ask is, are there other Christians who are worthy or not worthy of receiving communion? And I think this is a much bigger issue than whether you give it or withhold it from one person like Joe Biden, or whether you withhold it from millions of people. Well, even like your wife, who faithfully attended week after week after week as a Christian, but was denied communion. Why isn't that the issue, rather than whether somebody who is as devout as Joe Biden is? I mean, you have to go all the way back to Jimmy Carter to find a president who is as devout as Joe Biden is. And why anybody would want to deny him communion, given his public practice of Catholicism, befuddles me. But the bigger issue to me seems to be, why withhold it from anybody, any practicing Christian?
We've lost
That's the teaching
Shea
of the
for
church.
a minute.
Say what?
Dr. Shea accidentally logged off. I think he'll be back with us in just a minute.
Okay. I'm going to go on. We'll come back and talk with him about that. Finally, in Asheville, North Carolina, the influential Christian publication World, published in Asheville, North Carolina, near where I am, is undergoing a significant transformation. Launched in 1973, the periodical and web presence has become a conservative alternative to the larger Christianity Today enterprise, which has dominated the evangelical world ever since it was launched by Billy Graham 70 years ago. Last month, the long-serving editor Marvin Olasky, he's been at the job since 1994, has been pushed out, largely under the influence and ambition of Albert Mohler. Mohler president of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, and a recent convert to Trumpism, is the freshly appointed editor of a new section called World Opinions. It was a development that emerged outside of the leadership of editor Olasky. Olasky and World have been well known in publishing circles for his particular views of what he calls Christian journalism, and he uses the phrase biblical objectivity. That's all the news, brought to you by Coffee. Our partners, perfectocoffeeinc.com, Perfecto Coffee out in California. Forgive my lack of memory there. You can go online at perfectocoffeeinc.com and order your coffee. I'm going to send some to David Shea for being on the show today. We'll be back in just a minute.
Dwight, can you hear me? Dwight, are you able to hear me? I have to.
Yes, you're fine.
Okay, I missed.
David Shea and I are back in the meeting house.
I don't think I answered your question. In the middle of your question, I ran into some technical issues.
Yes, so I had raised the question about the denial of communion, not to a practicing Catholic like Joe Biden, but to a practicing Christian like me.
Right. So the way I answer this is that if in the context of Catholic worship, whether we're talking about weekday or Sunday Mass or weekend Mass, or let's say it's more likely to occur at a funeral or a wedding, that's taking place in the context of Catholic Mass. If a non-Catholic comes forward to receive communion, the Catholic Church does not deny that individual communion. Sometimes the presider at Mass or at a wedding or a funeral may take a moment to simply explain that sadly the Catholic communion is not open to non-Catholics, but we invite people to come forward with their hands and arms crossed to receive a blessing. So, for example, I did a funeral a few weeks ago for a deceased special services man, and members of his original special services unit were seated down front. There were probably about 8 of them, as I recall. Some were Catholic, but several were not. Every single one of those men came forward. Those who were Catholic received communion, and the non-Catholics, I blessed every single one of them. But if an individual, of whether we're talking about Catholic or non-Catholic, comes forward for communion and extends his or her hands to receive the Eucharist, we do not withhold the Eucharist from them. Now, we may talk to them after the fact, after Mass, explain to them, but in the context of receiving communion and coming forward in procession with other members of the faithful, we don't deny them the Eucharist.
Well, this conversation about the sacramental practice here leads us into the broader issue of the decline in sacramental practice among Catholics. I reported about 5 weeks ago about your own archdiocese there in Cincinnati.
Right.
The large restructuring that is going on, really in some ways constricting, pulling in due to the pretty steep decline in people coming for communion or for any of the sacramental ceremonies. Where does all that stand, and how do you read this? Because this preceded the pandemic.
It did. There was a trend already, sadly, in evidence of declining numbers of Catholics coming to Sunday Mass, coming to weekend Mass, receiving the sacraments with regularity. So that trend was in evidence, and it was only made substantially worse by the pandemic. So here in Ohio, the bishops of Ohio made a decision And I think it was in the spring 2020 timeframe, they made a decision to waive the Sunday Mass obligation for Catholics, um, because they didn't want people to feel pressure under the obligation to go to weekend Mass to have to come to Mass when they might be taking action that would be risky for their health. Um, so it was unprecedented in Catholic history that the Sunday Mass obligation would be waived, but it was. The group of bishops here in Ohio made that decision. And
Was that decision made anywhere else in the world? Were there
I
other
don't know
bishops?
the answer to that with factually, Dwight. My guess is yes. I would think that several dioceses, not only across the United States, but in other places of the world, made similar kinds of decisions. But what happened is that it went on for several months, such that the practice of going to Sunday Mass um, changed. So folks who had been accustomed to, getting ready to go to church on Sunday morning,
Mhm.
many of them streamed, okay, because that's the other thing that happened is many parishes learned how to handle technology. So masses, I mean, you could just use your phone while you're still in your pajamas or your
All right.
jogging sweats, and you could sit there with a cup of coffee and you could stream the Catholic Mass. You couldn't, of course, receive the Eucharist, and that was a big issue, a big concern. But you didn't have to pack up the family in the car and drive and find a parking spot and walk into church to go to Mass. So a lot of people changed their Sunday morning habits, sadly.
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
Not just Catholics, but I mean Christians all over the world.
right. So here, when the Sunday Mass obligation was restored in the late spring timeframe of this past year, 2021, you saw an initial jump in the numbers of folks coming back to Mass. But when you look at it now over a period of months, is we are down from pre-pandemic levels, probably, anywhere from 15 to 30% in what we already had trends that were showing declines, and the pandemic only worsened them. So mass attendance has become a real issue. And here in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, there are a lot of practical reasons that are driving this program called, Beacons of Light, which we've talked about on previous broadcasts, where there is a restructuring across the entire Archdiocese, and the creation of what's called families, where parishes, anywhere from a couple of parishes to 5 or 6 parishes are brought together into these families, and where each family will deal with the issues of mass schedules. What are we going to do about consolidating schools? What about clergy? A priest, who will be the pastor, who will be what priest will be assigned to each family? And they're going to deal with all of these issues. Ultimately, which buildings, out of economic necessity and practicality, may have to close. Some of the churches will have to close because it's not viable for the small numbers of people to keep them open. I heard a number of $1.7 million, and I think that's only a partial number, in maintenance and repair work and reconstruction that would have to take place in church building after church building across the Archdiocese. And the funds for that just simply don't exist. So here in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, this Beacons of Light program is an effort to restructure the Archdiocese, affecting just virtually every single parish, every single community, in dealing with what will be some really challenging issues over the next couple of years.
Well, David, this is not just a Catholic thing. This is a Christian thing across every community. I was on a Zoom call 2 days ago with Baptist ministers in North and South Carolina. All of them testified to significant declines in attendance in very Baptist states of South Carolina and North Carolina. And one of the main points of conversation is, how can we repurpose the buildings
Yes.
that we
Yep.
own uh, to serve the community, because they do not anticipate the attendance returning. And that's what you're saying as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I heard some numbers for our parish. Our parish is a large suburban parish. And originally it was about 3,200 families. That's a big parish in the
It
Archdiocese,
is.
Um, and if you go back 20 years, weekend mass attendance was, 3,500 to 4,000 people. And pre-pandemic levels, that number was more like 2,500. So it
Mhm.
had already declined. And now we're obviously still in a pandemic, but after restoring the Sunday Mass obligation and with vaccinations and things getting somewhat better, is that our numbers are we're averaging below 2,000 people on a
Mhm.
typical weekend. Now, having said that, we still track how many devices rather are
Right.
still
Plugging
streaming
into your.
weekend masses, and those numbers are impressive. Of course, we
They
don't know
are.
how many people. We know there's 1,500, 1,800 devices that are turned on to watch mass or one of the masses on a weekend. So if you take that number plus the number of people who are physically showing up for mass, then those numbers are up. But does streaming a mass, does it come close to being physically present and being part of a congregation and able to receive the Eucharist?
Boy,
They're two entirely different things.
This is the dominant conversation among Protestant ministers today. I'm an advocate, as you know. I'm preaching every Sunday now, so I'm very much attuned to this. We have a very small group that gathers in the sanctuary, a much larger group that taps in through a device. But can you build a community,
Yep.
Congregations, even among Protestants who don't have this the theology of the Eucharist that Catholics have, where just the reading the word, the preaching of the word is a more central element to our is the central element to our worship, and that can be done a little easier through the distance. Not, but certainly, like you pointed out, you can't give and receive the Eucharist on Zoom, can you?
No, you sure can't.
You sure can't.
And as a deacon, I've been a Catholic my entire life. Catholicism has been important to me for all of my life. I didn't go through a period of time where I kind of wandered away from the church. I was fortunate. I don't take any special credit for that. But my experience of being physically in church and in a community is very, very positive. I cannot imagine not being together with those
I
people
know.
on a weekly basis. It's an uplifting, positive experience. You connect with people, you get up to date on their lives, they on your lives. I stand in the vestibule before and after Mass, and I talk to maybe, if I'm lucky, 150, 200 people.
Yeah.
And I get prayer intentions from people. I find out who's getting married, who's sick, who just got pregnant, who needs a baptism. It's all wonderfully positive. So you stay connected with these people, and that's such an important part of life. And these are people, I know hundreds of people, and thousands of them know me, and it's supportive. And to go without that, I can't imagine without religion, without being an active part of a congregation, whatever your religion might be, on an ongoing basis. I think that's a huge loss to individuals, to couples and families. And I think that there are long-term, very negative consequences of that.
It's going to be very interesting. Those of us like you as a Catholic and myself as a Baptist, not only to watch this, but to try to lead congregations through the challenge. As you mentioned a little earlier, the decline in religious observance preceded the pandemic, and it driven by a number of things that are not related to the pandemic, driven by politics and driven by, I read an article just this morning of of a professor here in North Carolina who talked about why she had left the church, and it was as much about the failure of the church to engage in significant ways the big issues of our day, like climate change or racial reconciliation or economic justice. And she said the fact that the church was not doing this, just really pushed her out of the fold. And we're in a time when, we're losing our market share, both as Baptists and as Catholics. It's a real challenge to us, David.
Yeah. That article that I shared with you called Church Collapse in Cincinnati, that was dated October the 1st, written by a Rod Dreyer. I guess, I hope that's
yes, I know Rod. I've read Rod Dreyer. He's a very, very conservative evangelical. He's a member of the Orthodox Church, down in Baton Rouge, Louisiana.
Yeah, and he writes. I've got the article in front of me, but what he said is his conclusion, his analysis. And I think it's a very balanced article, a very good perspective. He said we live within a de-Christianizing culture. And he goes on to say, it is not at all clear to me that there is a killer app, referring to an app that we could just download, that will turn this situation around for Catholics and any other church for that matter. And then he goes on to say, why is it that people are not being fed anymore? Why are they not, going to church with regularity? And he says, why don't people want what the church offer? And he says, my guess is they don't think they can get what they want and need at church.
Yes.
He said, to be fair to us church folks, if people come to church thinking that it's going to provide them with some kind of magic course of instruction that improves their lives without them having to do anything, they are not going to find it. And he says, everybody wants to go to heaven, I sometimes begin the infant baptism by asking for a show of hands. I'll say, how many here? And let's say there's 50 to 75 people. It's a small congregation. I'll be baptizing a couple of infants, and I'll ask the question, how many of you here? And it seems like such an obvious question. How many of you here, want to get to heaven? Well, there's a little hesitancy at first. I guess they're wondering whether I'm being completely sincere. But the hands go. I raise my hand, and everybody raises the hand. Everybody wants to end up in heaven, but the question becomes, how do we live the rest of our lives here on earth so that we have the best possible chance of ending up in the place where we all want to be? Yeah. And I think that religion, particularly those religions that place demands on people's lives and make it challenging for them, or put boundaries on what they can and cannot do, people would prefer to make all of those decisions for themselves and not be pushed into doing things that they feel forced to go into,
Well, we have a real challenge in front of us, David. We're both in our 70s. We've lived through what may have been the heyday of religion in America, but we're going to be faithful, and we're going to minister to these people and see where the Lord leads. David, thank you for being with me in the Meeting House again today. We'll do this again real soon. And God bless you in your work there in Cincinnati.
Yeah, thank you, Dwight. God bless you, and happy Thanksgiving to you and your family.
I'll be back in just a minute in the Meeting House with a little C.S. Lewis. I read no reviews. I did no background check on the movie, but I'll wager a full month's Social Security check that the script of this movie is taken verbatim from the autobiography of Mr. Lewis himself, entitled Surprised by Joy, The Shape of My Early Life. He published that book in 1955 to describe his journey up to and including his conversion to Christianity in 1931, soon after he turned 30 years old. That means, of course, that the movie features beautiful prose spoken wonderfully by the actor Max McLean. He does a good job of representing the aging Lewis as he watches, even narrates scenes from his own life, the childhood, the death of his mother, his service in World War I, his entry into Oxford University. The format of the movie is a little odd, and when I first sat down in the theater and began to watch, I feared I had wandered into the wrong room or had a serious misunderstanding of what I had paid to see. The movie opens and closes with footage of the movie being made. Cameras you see, and lights, and scores of crew bustling around preparing to shoot the film, while the main character, Max McLean as Mr. Lewis, is reciting his lines directly into the camera. It's a very clever thing, but it had me confused. I was fearful that the entire movie was going to be this way, but it wasn't. And I'm glad. And glad also that the steady monologue, however lovely and beautifully spoken in that beautiful British accent, was interrupted now and again by carefully crafted vignettes, scenes from Lewis's life. Two boys, 10 and 12, watching by the bedside of their dying mother. Again, two young university students in a dorm room discussing the justification for believing in God at all. And in between them, a squad of soldiers ambushed by German fire and later convalescing in a hospital. These brief vignettes are well done, the lighting, the costumes, the dialogue, but I'll have to say they lack what the entire movie lacks. The one thing that a movie needs: the drama that makes the story interesting or compelling or watchable. Yes, I watched it because I have a 50-year interest in Lewis, not because this was a powerful movie, one that I might encourage you to see. If you're fascinated by Lewis or have been influenced by Lewis, you'll appreciate the film, perhaps even recommend it to a friend. The Lewis story is fascinating because of what he became: a first-rate scholar, a fabulous writer of essays, novels, and this memoir, a chronicler of a converted life, when so much of the movement in religion is in the other direction, people surrendering their faith instead of embracing it. The climax of the movie is a scene of communion, the Eucharist, as we've been talking about here in the Meetinghouse. It shows Lewis receiving the Eucharist in an Episcopal church, not a Catholic church, as a way of announcing his full conversion. Lewis started attending daily prayers when he became, as he tells it, the most reluctant convert in all of England, end quote. He had been baptized as an infant in the Church of Ireland, but renounced his faith at the ripe old age of 14. He worked his way back under the influence of later luminaries like J.R.R. Tolkien, himself a Roman Catholic. When his journey led him to believe in God and in Jesus as the Son of God, he simply got up from his pew during the Christmas season, made his way down to the front to receive the elements of the Eucharist. That's the way the movie ends. It made me wonder if those in the theater, unfamiliar with this story, understood what was happening. I didn't pause to inquire. I hurried out, drove home, put a sweet potato in the oven, and turned on the television to watch a Kentucky basketball game. life goes on, as it did for Lewis until his death in 1963. He was just shy of 65 years old, but here we are, 60 years later, watching films and stage productions, reading books and scholarly articles, still celebrating the most reluctant convert of the 20th century. I'm Dwight Moody in the Meetinghouse. I'll be back in just a minute. You'll have to go to the website to read my commentary. I've run out of time. Thank you for listening or watching in the Meetinghouse today to our conversation on religion and American life. Themeetinghouse.net. You can subscribe to the newsletter. You can make a contribution. You can listen to this podcast again. Join us next week in the Meetinghouse. Until then, get the vaccine. I'm scheduled to get my booster shot this afternoon at 4 o'clock. Be kind to everyone. I'll see you next week in the Meetinghouse. I'm Dwight A. Moody.
You have been in the Meetinghouse with host Dwight A. Moody. Thank you for watching or listening today. Visit our website at themeetinghouse.net for more news, reviews, commentaries, and conversation on religion and American life.